A lonely rancher took in a starving girl, then lost everything overnight. But what she did next changed their fate forever. A cold wind rattled the edges of the little cabin, where Clara sat hunched over a small fire, the smoke curling toward the cracked rafters, as if it too was searching for something lost. Her fingers, stiff and blistered from years of work and grief, carefully turned over the folded letter that had come to her door, sealed with red wax, its corners sharp against her calloused skin. It smelled like pine smoke and old hay, and the ink was faded but deliberate, written in a slanted, careful hand. "Miss Clara Boone," it began, and it wasn't flirtation she read in the words, but something quieter, maybe lonelier. The man who wrote it didn't offer poetry, he offered a roof, cattle, and the promise of peace. His name was Eldon Rusk. No declarations of love, just a clear sentence: "I do not drink, I do not strike, you'll have your own room till you say otherwise." No last name at the top, no warmth in the greeting, just a name at the end that landed like a stone in her chest. Her brother had vanished in the war, not a letter since Shiloh. Her mother died the winter before, crushed under a stove, trying to save the last of the cornmeal. The walls still smelled faintly of smoke and scorched beans. And Clara had no more family, no savings, no neighbors who spoke her name without a wince of pity or suspicion. So she packed what little she had: her mother's worn brooch, a shotgun with 2 shells, and the silence that grief had left behind. She boarded the stagecoach to Drywell, her boots stitched up the sides, her spine straight as if daring life to knock her down again. But when the wheels stopped grinding and the dust cleared, no one waited for her, not Eldon, not anyone. The dry wind met her like an old rival, tugging at her coat and whispering warning. For 3 days she waited at the station, her bed a pile of hay in the livery loft, brushing horseflies from her cheeks and ignoring the stares of strangers who wondered what kind of woman traveled alone and armed. On the 4th day, without being summoned, without being fetched, she walked the 5 miles east to Roskland with the kind of determination that only comes after everything else has been taken. The sun carved shadows across the hills, and dust swirled around her boots, mixing with blood from fresh blisters. She passed scorched fences and half-collapsed barns, the land looking as tired as she felt. But she kept walking, until the outline of a house rose before her, like a ghost, too stubborn to fade. The door was closed, but the barn was not. Inside she found a man sleeping on a cot, with one boot off, a knife strapped to his belt, and a bruise swelling along his thigh. His beard was the color of cedar bark, and even in sleep, his jaw was set like a man ready for anything. Clara didn't call his name. She raised her shotgun and cocked it. He woke fast, rolled, reached for the knife, and met her eyes with something like recognition. "You Rusk?" she asked. "You Clara Boone?" he replied. She didn't lower the gun, he explained, voice low and slow, that he'd been ambushed out past Coyote Creek, took a bullet to the leg, and lost everything but his pride. Been sleeping in the barn ever since. Said the house had been closed since his mother passed. Said the smell kept him out. Clara looked past him into the gloom. "It didn't matter. You got land?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. Cattle, 15 head, 2 mules. One of 'em's mean. You still want a partner?" He nodded once. She lowered the shotgun. "Then get up," she said. "I'm not sleeping in a barn unless you plan to build me a loft." And just like that, without kiss or promise, they started something raw and half-built, but alive. That first night, she boiled water in a rusted pot and scrubbed his wound clean, ignoring the way he gritted his teeth and looked away from her eyes. She didn't flinch, didn't speak, she just worked. And when dawn crept over Ruskland, the windows were open and the house no longer smelled of death. But peace didn't follow. The sheriff came before noon, tipped his hat, and asked too many questions. "We married last night," Clara said without blinking. Eldon stood beside her, silent and solid. No preacher, no paper, just firelight and will. The whispers in town didn't stop. They grew louder, more curious. A woman alone, moving into a broken-down ranch. healing a wounded man, and cleaning blood from a stranger's leg with her teeth clenched. That wasn't normal, that was something to talk about, but Clara didn't care. She rebuilt the house board by board. She beat the rugs until they bled dust. She burned the curtains, replaced the windows, laid canvas across the parlor floor so the cold wouldn't rise up through the wood. Eldon worked too, but different. He left in the mornings with a rifle, and came back with his clothes torn, and blood not from cattle. He never said what he hunted. Clara never asked. They shared space, not words. Nights he slept in the barn, still stubborn or maybe still ashamed. He brought her a saddle one morning and mumbled, "Needs a woman's hands," then walked away. One day she found a rusted box under the hearth. Inside, a green cracked ring, and a bundle of flowers pressed in a book of Kansas law. She kept the ring, burned the book. The quiet broke when Eldon returned, with a stranger, Thired Granger, slick-haired and too clean, come to buy the West Ridge for sheep. Clara didn't answer. She stirred beans, added wild onion and salt pork. When Granger smiled and asked if she was the wife, she answered, "I'm claiming the fire." That night, no one spoke. Weeks passed. Clara stitched, chopped, dug, and rebuilt, until she found the child, thin, filthy, hiding in the root cellar with a tin knife, and jerky stolen from somewhere. Clara didn't yell, just sat on the floor and waited. The girl, maybe 10, maybe 12, leaned into her shoulder and slept. They called her Mercy. She didn't speak for days, didn't trust Eldon, but she followed Clara everywhere. She caught birds, ate scraps, learned to skin rabbits. Then came the first fire. The barn lit up like kindling, the cattle screaming. Mercy ran with a bucket, barefoot and fearless. Clara caught her before she crossed the fence. "You want to die for a barn?" she asked, but she helped her anyway. Together they saved it. The bullet casing they found wasn't a warning, it was a threat. Granger's men were closing in, slowly, surely. That night, Clara sharpened her knife, and when Mercy hummed a song without words at her feet, Clara knew, this wasn't just survival anymore, this was war. Clara didn't wait for anyone to come looking. After 3 nights on hayloft floors and meals made of stale bread and silence, she decided to find Eldon Rusk herself. With nothing but her mother's brooch pinned to her collar, and a shotgun slung over her shoulder, she walked 5 miles through dry heat and dust-choked wind to reach a place she had only ever seen in the ink of a letter. Her feet ached, her boots blistered, and the land looked more broken than promised. Fences falling in on themselves, the skeleton of a barn scorched along one side, and a house that sagged like it had been forgotten for a lifetime. But she didn't stop. She climbed the final ridge, and saw that while the house was shuttered and silent, the barn whispered with life. Something or someone was inside. She stepped cautiously, gripping the shotgun with both hands, ready for anything. Inside she found a man sprawled across a cot, one boot off, a dark stain blooming beneath his thigh. He was sleeping, barely, his hand resting near a knife, breath shallow. His face was rough, but not cruel, the kind of face that looked like it had once known hope, and then forgotten the shape of it. Clara didn't speak. She cocked the shotgun instead. The sound woke him like thunder. He rolled, eyes flashing, hand reaching for the blade. Their eyes locked, both stubborn, both waiting for the other to blink. "You Rusk?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "You Clara Boone." Her grip didn't loosen. "You were meant to meet me," she said. "I was," he admitted, voice low. "Got jumped out past Coyote Creek, took a bullet, got stripped of everything but my name." He shifted, wincing from the pain, his leg clearly worse than he was letting on. "Didn't want you to see the house. Not like this." He motioned weakly toward the main structure. "Ain't been in there since Ma passed. Still smells like death." Clara's face didn't change. "You got land?" she asked. "Yes ma'am." "Cattle?" 15 head, 2 mules. "One of 'em bites. You still want a partner?" "I do," he said, as if confessing a sin. She nodded once, slowly, then said, "Then get up. I'm not sleeping in a barn unless you're planning to build me a loft." And just like that, the rules of their world were rewritten. She helped him rise, saw the full extent of his wound, the way he gritted his teeth and swayed, but he didn't complain. She supported him to the house, even though he warned her of the smell, the rot, the memories soaked into the walls. She said nothing, just opened the door and stepped into the past he'd been too afraid to clean. The house smelled like old fire and dust, but also like something waiting. She opened every window, let the stale ghosts out. Then she boiled water, washed the blood from his leg, and tore sheets into strips for bandages. She moved without asking, her hands firm, her eyes clearer than he'd expected. And when he bit down on a leather strap and refused to cry out, she stitched the wound like she was sewing the last piece of her life together. That night, Clara didn't sleep. She scrubbed the floors until her knuckles split. She found a rat's nest in the pantry and cleared it with a broom and the barrel of the shotgun. She opened the hearth and built a fire with wood too green, but it burned anyway. She made weak coffee and sat by the window until the sky went pink with morn. Eldon, still stiff from pain, tried to stand and help, but she waved him down. You said you wanted a partner. Partners don't sit while the work's being done. By noon she had burned the old curtains and beaten the rugs with a branch until they gave up their dust. She ripped up the rotting floorboards and laid canvas soaked in vinegar to keep the damp from bleeding back in. The stove barely held a flame, but she made beans and cut wild onion into them because it reminded her of Arkansas. Eldon watched her from the chair she dragged in from the porch. He didn't speak much. She didn't ask questions. It was a rhythm they fell into, like two animals learning the edge of each other's territory. That evening, he tried to explain himself. I meant to meet you, I swear. She didn't look up from the stitching she was doing on a torn saddle blanket. You didn't, she said, but there was no anger in it, just fact. He opened his mouth to reply, then closed it. Instead, he limped out to the barn and came back dragging a crate of nails and a hammer. Figured I'd start fixing the porch, he said. It leans worse than I did. Clara nodded. She didn't thank him, and he didn't expect it. They worked side by side as the sun dropped, both of them too proud and too bruised to say the thing that hung between them, that maybe this wasn't about rebuilding a house, maybe it was about rebuilding themselves. Days passed. Clara found a rusted bucket under the steps and filled it with lion-boiled shirts until they turned white again. She found a cracked mirror behind a loose panel and used it to shave Eldon's face when he couldn't lift his arm. She didn't flinch at the scar beneath his jaw or the way his skin was drawn tight with old pain. He watched her like someone trying to read a language he used to know. At night she sat on the porch with her mother's brooch in her hand, turning it over and over like it might tell her what came next. On the third day, the sheriff came. He leaned on the gate and looked at them both like they were a riddle. Folks are talking. Say you're living under one roof, unmarried. Clara met his gaze without blinking. We married last night, she said. Eldon stood beside her, silent, back straight. Wasn't no preacher, the sheriff muttered. Didn't need one, Clara replied. Just fire and a prom. The sheriff squinted, nodded once, then walked off. When he was gone, Clara went back to scrubbing the hearth, her sleeves rolled up, her hands raw with soap. Eldon stood in the doorway, a man not quite sure what he'd signed up for, but starting to believe it might be more than he deserved. That night, as the wind knocked against the shutters and the coyotes cried in the distance, Clara sat by the fire with her shotgun across her lap. Eldon sat across from her, his leg propped on a crate, watching the flames flicker. He didn't speak, neither did she. But in that silence, something began. Not love, not yet, but maybe the start of something that could survive where softer things had died. Whispers travel faster than wind in a town like Drywell, and it didn't take long before Clara's name began slipping through door cracks and drifting through saloon smoke like a question no one wanted to ask out loud. A woman with no man to guide her, walking into a broken house on cursed land, dragging behind her a silence sharp enough to cut. Folks didn't know what to make of it. She wore boots meant for travel, not comfort, and she looked people in the eye like she was measuring their worth before they could speak. By the time word reached the sheriff, the rumors were already thick. Some said she was a war widow turned mad. Others claimed she was some outlaw's bride, hiding from justice. But none of them could explain why Eldon Rusk, the man who hadn't stepped foot in town in a year, was standing beside her on that porch, face pale from blood loss but posture straight as fence wire. When the sheriff rode up slow, dust rising around his horse's hooves, Clara didn't wait for introductions. She wiped her hands on a lye-stained apron, stepped off the porch, and met him by the gate, with soap still in her knuckles. He squinted beneath his hat. "Folks are saying you're under the same roof. That true?" Clara didn't blink. "We married last night." The words hung like smoke in the dry air. "No preacher?" the sheriff asked. "No witnesses?" Clara stared right through him. "Didn't need either. We had fire and a promise." The sheriff's brow furrowed, but he said nothing more. Maybe he saw it in her eyes, that same steel that made her scrub floors until her knees cracked and her fingers bled, or the way she carried the shotgun not for show but like a part of her spine. He turned his horse and rode off without another word. From that day on, the town watched her, not just with judgment, but with something darker, something that mixed fear with wonder. People didn't understand women who made choices without permission. They didn't know what to do with a woman who didn't flinch, didn't smile unless it meant something, and didn't bother hiding her strength. Clara wasn't just surviving on Rusk land, she was claiming it, one floorboard at a time. She tore down curtains that smelled like mildew and ghosts, tossed rugs into the creek, and beat them with branches until clouds of filth coughed into the air. Every nail she hammered was a declaration. Every plank she reset a memory she refused to let rot. At night she boiled water and soaked her aching hands, while Eldon sat nearby, watching her like someone watching a storm they couldn't quite name. He spoke little, worked when he could, and limped always, but never complained. He began to follow her rhythm. When she dug out the root cellar, he brought the tools. When she pulled the rusted hinges from the back door, he held the frame steady. Still he kept his distance after sundown. He'd sleep in the barn, nay out of guilt, maybe because the weight of what he hadn't done, the waiting, the absence, the wound, was too heavy to share a roof with just yet. Clara didn't push him. She didn't offer comfort or conversation. She offered work, and he answered it. They were partners in silence, bound by motion more than words. She fixed what was broken, and he watched her do it, not with shame, but with something that might have been gratitude if it had the courage to speak. The land around them didn't make it easy. Wind screamed through the shutters at night, like it was mourning something lost. Coyotes skulked too close. The soil cracked in the heat, and turned muddy in the rain. But Clara met each day with the same tired fire, laundering rags, salting beans, sewing torn seams in Eldon's shirts, even though he never asked. When a plank sagged, she braced it. When a nail snapped, she pulled it out and started again. She found an old comb behind the stove, cleaned it with boiling vinegar, and used it to braid her hair, so it wouldn't catch while she worked. The simple act felt like armor. Eldon, for his part, began to move with more purpose. He brought back planks from a collapsed fence line, and used them to reinforce the back wall. He found an old horseshoe and nailed it to the threshold without explanation. When Clara looked at it, he shrugged. "Can't hurt," he said. She didn't respond but left it there. One morning, he handed her a worn leather pouch, with sewing needles, and said, "Found it in Ma's trunk." That was the only time he mentioned his mother. Clara nodded and added it to her basket. Trust didn't bloom. It chipped away like ice melting slow. She still didn't know what kept him up some nights, pacing the barn or staring off at the hills like they held ghosts. She didn't ask. She had her own. The porch became her favorite place, not for rest but for its view of what was being built. She could see the patched roof, the cleaned path to the well, the way the fence lines began to look straight again. Every evening, she sat there as the sun dropped, shotgun nearby, fingers raw but steady. She wasn't watching for danger. She was watching to make sure nothing tried to take back what she had claimed. Because everything she did, the boiling, the scrubbing, the nailing, the stitching, wasn't just for survival, it was for possession. She wasn't fixing someone else's home, she was creating. And the town, they couldn't stop talking. She scrubbed the house like she was chasing out spirits. One woman muttered at the mercantile, "He just watches her like a dog that got fed after a beating." Someone else said behind a bottle, but no one said it to her face. Because when Clara came into town, she did it like she didn't owe them anything. Boots clean, shirt tucked, brooch still fastened at her throat, even when tarnished. People stared, but they stepped aside. They saw the way she looked at the shelves,
not scanning but measuring. And when she left, she didn't walk faster, she didn't look back. The silence she carried with her was heavier than noise. The children didn't play near her wagon, the men didn't offer to help carry goods. They watched, because they didn't understand her, and what people don't understand they fear, especially when it walks like it's unafraid. Back at the ranch, Clara kept going. She found a hidden drawer in the back room, with papers too old to read, and a comb carved from bone. She buried the papers, kept the comb. She marked time by what was fixed, not by date. One afternoon, she climbed onto the roof alone to patch a leak. Eldon tried to help, but she waved him off. "You've got work," she said, pointing to the fence line. He didn't argue, that was how they worked. Parallel, not tangled, but it was in. And in the evenings, when the fire burned low and their shadows stretched across the walls, Clara didn't feel alone. She didn't feel loved either, not yet, but she felt sick. Slowly, painfully, and with no promises, they were becoming something the town couldn't explain, something more than rumor and less than legend, but something real, something worth fighting for.
The wind had been strange for days, curling in from the west, like it carried whispers too heavy to speak aloud. And Clara had learned by now to listen when the world around her changed its tone. She had been digging in the back orchard, trying to uproot an old stump that refused to rot, when she noticed prints in the dirt, barefoot, small and far too fresh to belong to anything wild. She followed them past the chicken coop, and toward the root cellar door, which hung slightly ajar, something it had never done under her watch. She approached slow, her shotgun slung but ready, the silence hanging thick like breath held too long. Inside, the air was damp, the walls lined with preserved jars and forgotten tools, and in the furthest corner, huddled against a crate of spoiled apples, sat a girl no older than 10, thin as a rake, her cheeks sunken and her eyes burning with the same kind of fire Clara had carried in her chest not long ago. The child gripped a rusted tin knife in one hand and a strip of jerky in the other, as if both could save her. She bared her teeth like an animal when Clara stepped closer, hissing instead of speaking, but Clara didn't flinch. She didn't threaten or beg. She lowered herself to the dirt floor slowly, her joints aching, her hands open and empty. "You hiding or hungry?" she asked softly. The girl said nothing, but the jerky slipped from her fingers, and after a long tense minute she crept forward like a stray cat, and laid her head against Clara's shoulder. Clara didn't move until she was sure the girl was asleep, her breath soft and shallow like she hadn't rested in weeks. They named her Mercy, though she never said if she liked it. She didn't speak for the first 5 days, not a word, just ate whatever she could catch. Mice, birds too weak to fly, even half-rotten fruit. Clara thought only the crows would touch. Clara taught her how to boil water, how to use a knife without cutting herself, how to gut a rabbit without wasting meat. Eldon built a small cot in the corner room and fixed the windows so the wind wouldn't scream through them at night. Mercy avoided his hands, not out of fear, but something more cautious, like she was still deciding if men could be trusted at all. Clara didn't push her. They lived in a fragile rhythm, days filled with chores and nights with silence. But it couldn't last. The first fire came just after midnight. Clara was half asleep when the crack jolted her upright, a sound she'd heard once before, in the fire that took her mother. Not thunder, not wind, wood breaking under heat. The barn was glowing by the time she reached the porch, flames licking up the east wall like tongues hungry for history. The cattle screamed, penned, and panicked. Eldon grabbed his rifle and limped toward the smoke. Mercy was already ahead of both of them, barefoot in the dirt, hauling a bucket of water too heavy for her arms. Clara caught her by the elbow before she could cross the fence. "You want to die for a barn?" she shouted over the roar. Mercy didn't speak, just looked up with eyes that didn't belong to a child. That look said more than words ever could. It said she'd already lost enough. So Clara didn't argue. Together they hauled bucket after bucket, hands blistered, lungs choked with smoke, until dawn cracked open the sky and the fire finally died. The barn stood, blackened but upright, and somewhere inside the ash-and-soaked straw, Eldon found it, a bullet casing, long, not made for hunting, lodged deep in the support beam. He turned it over in his hand and said quietly, "This wasn't a warning, they're trying to ruin us." Clara sat in the soot,
pulling scorched nails from boards with her bare fingers, blood dripping from her palms, and said nothing, because she already knew the fire wasn't an accident. It was the start of something. Someone out there wanted what they had, and they were willing to take it, not with force but with slow destruction, ruin the barns, scare the cattle, break the fence lines, starve the owners, and when all that was done, show up with an offer too tempting to refuse. But Clara wasn't built to surrender. That morning, while Eldon scrubbed soot from the mule's water trough, and Mercy curled in a blanket too big for her, Clara wrote a letter. She didn't say who it was for. She folded it 3 times, sealed it with wax, and hid it beneath the floorboard in the parlor. She didn't mention it again. When she next rode into town, she wore a patched coat, stiff boots, and her mother's brooch still pinned to her collar, tarnished but steady. She didn't stop at the feed store or the grocer. She rode straight to the saloon. Inside, men froze mid-laugh. Granger was at his usual table, boots up, cigar in his teeth, looking like he'd never lost a thing in his life. Clara didn't speak until she stood over him. "You'll leave us alone," she said. He chuckled like it was a joke. "Beg your pardon. You heard me. I heard a girl with soot on her boots, trying to bark orders in a man's house." She bent low, face level with his. "You don't scare me. Not because I'm brave, but because I've buried men like you before, and I've still got the shovels." His smile faltered, just for a second. "Your husband know you're here playing outlaw. I'm the one who knows where the bullets are kept." She turned and walked out, never looking back. Granger didn't follow, but 2 nights later they struck again. This time it was the corral. Kerosene, Clara guessed, maybe poured slow in the dark while the cattle slept. Flames lit the sky like sunrise. They saved what they could, but 3 animals died. One of them, Mercy's calf, a spotted thing she'd named Dust. Clara found her curled beside its carcass at dawn, eyes empty, all her grief burned out. They buried the calf under the sycamore, and that night, Mercy finally spoke. "They wore masks," she said. "They came to my old house. I think they took my mama first, but I saw them. 2 had red bandanas, 1 had no shoes." Clara looked at Eldon. "You remember which way they went?" Mercy nodded toward the ridge. Clara had never been there, but Eldon, "There's an old mine in that canyon, used to be silver, but it collapsed. No one goes near it." "They do now," Clara said, and just like that they had a direction, they had a target, and none of them planned to wait for another fire.
Clara didn't wear her Sunday dress when she walked into the Drywell saloon. She wore her work coat, thick boots stained with ash, and a shotgun slung across her back, like a promise she didn't need to explain. The door swung behind her, and slammed shut with finality, silencing every card shuffle, drink pour, and half-told lie inside. She didn't hesitate, didn't blink. Her boots thudded hard against the warped wooden floor as she crossed the room, her gaze locked on the man lounging at the back table, like he owned the place, the town, the dirt under everyone's feet. Thade Granger. His coat was pressed, his cigar lit, and his boots up on a chair, as if no part of the world had ever dared say no to him. He didn't look surprised to see her. That made Clara angrier than anything. She stopped in front of him, hand resting on her hip, not on the shotgun. She didn't need the weight of a weapon to say what she was about to say. "You'll leave us alone," she told him, each word deliberate, not raised but sharp enough to draw blood. Granger smiled the way men do when they think you've overstepped. "Beg your pardon," as if he needed her to say it again for his own amusement. She didn't repeat herself. She just narrowed her eyes. "I heard a girl with soot on her boots try to bark in a man's saloon," he went on, chuckling like this was all some kind of show for the other. "You don't scare me," Clara said, her voice steady. "Not because I'm brave, because I've buried more than one man like you, and I still know where I left the shovels." The laughter around the room died a little. Granger's smile twitched, then faltered for half a breath. "Your husband know you're here?" he asked. "I'm the one who knows where the bullets are kept," she said, and with that she turned on her heel and walked out, her shadow long behind her in the lantern light. But the fire didn't stop. The next attack came under a moonless sky, and this time, they didn't just try to scare, they meant to destroy. The corral burned so fast they barely got the herd moving. 3 cows didn't make it. One of them was Dust, the calf Mercy had named and fed with her own hand. Clara found her at dawn, curled next to the charred body, her eyes hollow, no tears left.
That broke something deep. That night she spoke. They wore masks, she said. They were the ones that came to my house before. My mama didn't scream, she was already gone, but I saw them. Clara crouched in front of her, hands on her knees, steady and calm. Do you remember where they went? Mercy nodded toward the distant canyon, a jagged scar on the horizon. Eldon knew the place. Old mine shafts out that way, he said. Used to be silver there years ago. Collapsed. No one goes there anymore. They do now, Clara said. She didn't need to say anything else. The three of them packed before sunrise. No one spoke about what they were doing. No one had to. Mercy loaded a bag with food without being asked. Eldon took 2 rifles, rewrapped the sling on the one that misfired last week. Clara grabbed the shotgun, the knife from Arkansas, and the last of the ammunition hidden beneath the kitchen floorboard. They rode quiet, the mule's hooves soft against the dirt path, the stars overhead sharp as nails in the black sky. The wind was still, too still, like even the earth knew what they were doing. They left the house locked, the cattle penned, the porch lantern out. They climbed the ridge with care, tied the mule low in the trees, and went the rest of the way on foot. The mine loomed like a mouth too wide to belong to something dead. They didn't speak, didn't whisper, just moved together like shadows. The entrance yawned open, and inside it smelled of old dust and rusted regret. Just past the mouth, tucked behind a rock ledge, they found the camp. 3 bedrolls, a pot half full of beans, 2 bottles, and a rifle propped lazily against a stone. The men were asleep, limbs splayed, mouths open. They didn't look like monsters, just men who'd chosen the wrong thing one too many times. Eldon nodded once, tight. Clara took the first. Eldon took the second. It happened fast, silent. The third man woke with a jolt, but before he could scream or reach for his rifle, Mercy stepped out from behind Clara, lifted a rock bigger than her small hands should have been able to carry, and brought it down, once, twice, then silence. No one moved for a long moment, not even to breathe. Then Eldon reached out, and steadied her arm, not to stop her, but to let her know it was done. Mercy dropped the rock, her hands were red. She didn't cry. Clara led them out the way they came. No words passed between them on the ride home, but something shifted. The wind blew different. The air felt cleaner, like whatever had been haunting the edges of their land had been lifted. They got back just before dawn. Clara opened the door and went straight to the stove. She didn't light it. She just sat, still as stone, hands on her lap. Eldon cleaned the weapons, wiped every bit of soot and sweat from the barrels. Mercy went to her cot without being told. That morning, when the sun finally broke through the clouds and spread across the fields, it felt like the land was breathing for the first time in weeks. No smoke on the wind, no fear in the silence, just the heavy, hard-earned peace of a war that had taken something from all 3 of them, and left behind only what they'd chosen to keep.
Clara had always believed action was louder than grief, that healing came not in time, but in the work your hands could prove. So she didn't wait for the next attack like a woman hoping mercy would arrive with the wind. Instead, she woke before sunrise, tied her hair back with twine, slung her shotgun across her back, and rode the mule into town, with the kind of quiet purpose that didn't ask permission. She wore no corset, no lace gloves, only a patched coat, dust-caked boots, and a tarnished brooch that still clung to her collar, like the memory of a life that burned away long ago. When she stepped into the courthouse, her voice didn't waver, not when the clerk looked up with surprise, not when his ink-stained fingers fumbled with papers, not even when he asked if Eldon was sick or dead. "I'm not here about Eldon," Clara said, sliding a folded slip across the counter. "I'm naming heirs." The clerk unfolded it, eyes narrowing, mouths parting in surprise. "She's not your kin," he said, half question, half challenge. "She's more than blood," Clara replied. He didn't press further, just stamped the page, made 2 copies, and watched as she turned and walked out, like the ground beneath her had always been hers. When she returned to the ranch, the air felt different, thicker, expectant, as though the land itself was waiting to see what would happen next. The cattle were restless, the mule's ears twitched at every sound. Mercy sat on the porch, her knife resting across her lap, eyes scanning the distant hills like they were pages in a book she'd read before. "They're coming," she said, not afraid, just certain. Clara didn't ask how she knew. She simply nodded and started moving. That night, the three of them prepared with the wordless efficiency of people who had run out of chances and chosen not to run at all. Eldon counted bullets and oiled every gun, his hands steady, jaw set. Mercy lined the fences with broken glass, scrap wire, bells from an old sewing kit, anything that might scream a warning if touched. Clara moved the herd east to the gulch, then opened the gate wide, so if panic struck, the animals would run away from the house, not into. They didn't speak over supper. They didn't light the hearth. Instead, they waited, every sound outside stretching longer than the one before. The attack came before dawn, the air still and sharp with frost, the wind hiding its voice like it too was afraid of what was coming. 4 riders slipped through the sage like wolves, no torches, no words, just dark shapes moving low and fast. Clara saw them first from the kitchen window, their silhouettes slicing the early haze. She moved fast, threw open the door, and fired the first shot before they crossed the fence. One man fell from his horse. Eldon took the second with a clean shot to the chest, but the third crashed through the gate and into the barn. Mercy didn't hesitate. She dropped the bucket she'd been holding and ran. Clara screamed after her, but the girl was already gone, her feet sure on the dirt path even in the dark. Inside the barn it was chaos. The man had lit a match, oil dripping from his coat where he'd already begun to spill it. The air glowed with the promise of fire. Mercy didn't think. She launched herself at him, knocking the match from his hand, but he turned, slammed his elbow into her face, and sent her sprawling. He raised the match again, fury twisting his features, but then Eldon was there. He didn't He tackled the man into the support beam, the lantern falling and smashing between them. Oil sprayed, flame leapt. Clara had just reached the door when the blaze exploded into light. She dragged Mercy out by her arms, coughing, blind with smoke, heart pounding. "Where's Eldon?" she shouted, but the fire answered with a groan of splitting wood. Then, from the smoke, Eldon stumbled out, arms wrapped tight around a canvas sack, his coat smoldering, his eyes wild and shiny. He collapsed in the mud, laughing, not like a madman, but like someone who'd stolen victory from death's pocket. Inside the sack were deeds, land surveys, marriage licenses, every paper Granger ever claimed didn't exist, every document that proved Clara and Eldon didn't just live on this land, they owned it. The barn collapsed behind them, flame turning to smoke, but no one looked back. Clara kneeled beside him, her hands on the sack, on his shoulder, on the mud, on whatever was real and still here. Mercy stood beside them, rifle clutched to her chest, her cheek bruised and smeared with soot, eyes dry and unreadable. Then, from across the field a final shape moved. The 4th rider, trying to flee. Clara raised her shotgun, but Mercy stepped forward, took the weapon from her hands, braced it against the porch rail and fired once. The man dropped, a speck in the grass. No one spoke. They buried the dead in the morning, 2 men under the sycamore, no names, no markers. They didn't deserve them. Clara washed the blood from her hands in the same basin where she once scrubbed beans. Eldon sat on the porch, the sack of papers beside him, a bandage wrapped around his arm. Mercy stood guard with her rifle, back straight, shadow long. The land had taken so much, but it had given them something back, a name, a family, a future they hadn't asked for, but were now willing to protect at any cost. They didn't celebrate, they didn't rest, they prepared. Because even with the proof in their hands, they knew men like Granger didn't disappear without leaving behind venom. So Clara fixed the gates, Eldon rebuilt the barn, Mercy cleaned the rifle and oiled the stock, until it shined like bone in the sun. They were ready, they weren't waiting anymore. Spring arrived without thunder, without ceremony, but with a quiet kind of grace that wrapped around Rusk land like a long-awaited exhale. And for the first time in months, the soil didn't crack underfoot. It softened. The grass returned first, timid blades pushing through charred earth, green daring to exist where black had ruled for so long. Then came the trees, slow and stubborn, their bare limbs budding with fruit, as if waking from a long painful sleep. The orchard, once little more than stumps and ghosts, began to breathe again. Bees swarmed near the casks Clara had hollowed behind the shed, filling the air with the low hum of life restarting. No more riders came, no shadows on the ridge, no hoofbeats in the dark, no notes nailed to fence posts with blood-stained nails. The silence no longer felt like warning, it felt like peace. But Clara didn't stop working. She sealed the barn doors with iron hinges. Eldon forged himself. She stacked firewood high against the back wall, tied herbs in thick bunches across the rafters, filled every jar with something preserved. Eldon repaired the smokehouse roof without being asked, his limp nearly gone now, his beard trimmed closer than it had been since she arrived. Mercy took to patrolling the southern fence line, the rifle slung over her shoulder like a natural extension of her spine, her eyes always scanning, always calculating. She didn't talk much, but when she did, her voice carried weight. She carved little things in the evening, wooden birds, a galloping horse, a mule with ears too long. One night she handed Clara a figure of a woman standing tall, with her hair caught in an invisible wind. "I think she's you," she said. Clara turned it in her hand, thumb tracing the grooves. "She might be," she replied, then tucked it beside the brooch in her drawer. The town of Drywell changed its tune. Where once there were whispers, now there was silence, an almost respectful hush, that followed Clara whenever she rode into town. She didn't come off. When she did, she came prepared, boots clean, coat patched but strong, rope braided on her saddle horn, shotgun resting in its sling like a second spine. Mercy rode beside her, taller now, steadier, her eyes sharper than any girl her age had a right to be. No one whispered anymore. They watched. At the general store, the clerk who once asked too many questions now packed her supplies without comment. The saloon emptied half its chairs when she walked past. Even the sheriff only tipped his hat. They all knew what she'd done, even if they never spoke it aloud. They knew she'd faced down men with fire and walked away unburned. They knew her hands had blood and ash beneath the nails, and that she still raised bees, grew tomatoes, stitched saddle leather, and shot straighter than most of the men they knew. The rusk land no longer looked cursed. The fence line held, the herd had doubled, the porch lantern never flickered, and the barn, rebuilt lower and stronger with stone and steel, stood like a fortress against whatever might come next. And yet, despite all that was built, all that was repaired, Clara still remembered. She visited the sycamore often, where 3 graves lay side by side, unmarked but never forgotten. One for Dust, the calf Mercy had loved, the other 2 for the men who had come with matches and didn't leave. She never said their names. She never let Mercy say them either. Some stories were better left buried, but their presence grounded her. They were the cost. One morning, as fog lifted from the hills, and the sun painted long shadows across the fields, Clara climbed the ridge behind the barn, and looked down over everything they had saved. The orchard shimmered with dew, the cattle grazed slow and content, the barn caught the light just right, its new roof gleaming like a fresh promise. Mercy was below, brushing the mule with a firm hand, talking softly to it in that way she reserved for animals and storm. Eldon stood by the well filling a trough, his shirt damp with honest work, his movements slow but sure. Clara stood alone on that ridge, her coat flapping in the wind, hair braided down her back, hands resting on her hips. She didn't smile, she didn't cry, she just stood there, steady as the land beneath her feet, letting the wind pass through her like memory. She wasn't thinking about what had been lost anymore, she was thinking about what had been made. She had been a daughter once, a sister, a wanderer, a stranger in a strange house. She had married without vows and survived without asking for permission. She had fought, bled, buried and built. She had loved, though never softly. She had found a child in a cellar, and turned her into an heir. She had faced down men who thought they could burn her away and proved them wrong with every breath she still drew. The town didn't have a word for what she had become, not widow, not wife, not outlaw, not hero, but they remembered her, in the way they locked their doors tighter after sundown, in the way they warned their sons not to test a woman's silence, in the way they looked to the hills,
and whispered stories about the ranch that refused to fall, and Clara, standing there with the whole valley beneath her, didn't care about names. She didn't care if history remembered her face, or her deeds, or even her family. What mattered was this: the land had healed, Mercy was strong, Eldon was alive, and Clara herself scarred, weathered, stubborn. Clara was still standing, still refusing to bend, still refusing to run. She had once arrived with nothing but a letter and a memory of burnt beans in her nose. Now the air smelled like damp soil and honey, and when the wind rose again behind her, lifting her coat and curling through the tall grass like a quiet song, Clara didn't move. She let it pass through her, and she stayed, because she had become something more than survivor. She had become the kind of story the earth tells in roots and stone, the kind that doesn't need a name to be remembered.